Our next speaker is Professor Robert Mudida, who is an academic and also a good friend of the Jobs for Africa Foundation. He's our expert in economics. When I need anything about what is happening in Africa, I go to him. Robert has over 16 years of experience, including teaching at several leading universities, like the University of St. Gallen here in Switzerland. He's been in Switzerland to lecture, and we've taken walks around Lake Geneva when he's lecturing in Switzerland. And he's also been a lecturer at the University of Navarra in Spain. He heads at the Department of Policy, Strathmore Institute for Public Policy and Governance. And he's also been a consultant for the World Bank, especially when it comes to COVID-19. He has extensive research experience focusing on macroeconomics, political economy, and industrial organization, and has also published widely. So with his work with the World Bank, he's actually been, as I said, reflecting on the impact of COVID-19 and how it has affected several African countries. He's also been a consultant working with the Kenyan government when it comes to IGAD negotiations. Over to you, my dear friend, Professor Robert Mudida. And very privileged to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Fred, for those kind remarks. And it's a great privilege, ladies and gentlemen, to be here in this particular forum organized by Jobs for Africa. And I think it couldn't have come at a better time. This is certainly one of the critical issues that we face now. And the previous speaker was talking about the demographic dividend in Africa and how it's important. This is one of our greatest sources of opportunity, but also we need to come up with good policies in order to be able to capitalize and to be able to have vibrant economies. And I also like the fact that he talked about the need for a social dialogue, a very critical social dialogue. Okay, so my presentation has two parts. One is just getting a sense of how Africa has been hit by COVID-19. And the second part is some policy responses, some issues that I think are critical. And I would say if you look at the IMF projections, for example, for 2020, 2021, you see that Africa is going to be quite severely hit. Okay, so the projections for this year anticipate, in a medium scenario, they anticipate negative growth in Africa of 1.6%. All right, and it could even be worse, but that's a medium scenario, which is in general a bit worse than the overall prognosis for emerging economies. And then we are still better off, we can say, in a sense, than some economies where the growth is expected to be even more negative, and also compared to the overall world economy projections. By the way, this year is expected to be the worst year in the global economy since the Second World War. Okay, we thought about 10 years ago, when we had negative growth as well in the world economy following the global financial crisis, that was the worst that could hit us. But in fact, in terms of economic projections, this year is expected to be even worse. Of course, one issue that's very important to emphasize is that Africa is not one place. It's a very big place, and there are many different countries. So as we talk about the economic impact on Africa, it's very critical to emphasize that different African countries will be impacted to different degrees. We expect reduced growth across the board, okay? But some countries will be hit worse than others. And this reduced growth will come about from, first of all, the indirect effects of reduced external external demand. Africa is very open to global trade. We're very much a part of the global economy. So some of our key trade partners, especially Europe, China, North America, have been very adversely hit by the pandemic. In fact, in Europe now, they're talking about a second wave and an additional resurgence. And so they are taking very strict measures to try to deal with that. So we're going to be affected because a lot of the trade we've been getting from these key trading partners is going to reduce substantially because of the even more severe effects on them. Then, of course, a number of African countries also depend on commodity production, like, for example, oils and metals. And in general, there's been a steep fall in most commodity prices, maybe with the exception of gold, which experienced a slight increase because people were now reallocating some of their resources and saving in terms of gold, fearing currency depreciation. But otherwise, the majority of metals and also oil prices declined very sharply with COVID-19. They've experienced a slight resurgence in recent months, but overall, there's been a very adverse effect. So the economies that are hardest hit in Africa are those that depend heavily on oil and also metal exports. The ones also that are very hard hit are those that depend on tourism. So because, of course, COVID-19 and its spread was associated with now an almost global shutdown, considerable reduction in travel. One sector that was immediately hit very directly was tourism, and quite a number of African economies depend on tourism, some more than others. Then it's not only a question of being affected from the export side, we're also badly hit from the import side because global supply chains were disrupted. For example, many African countries depend a lot on imports from China and also Europe. And with this reduction in international travel, then the global supply chains were really badly hit. And the other aspect, of course, that's very important to keep in mind is that different African countries took measures to different degrees to stop the spread of the pandemic. Now, a very big policy challenge we faced was that many of those measures, whereas they helped to slow the spread of the pandemic, had a very adverse economic effect to different degrees, depending on whether the countries shut down totally, they had a complete lockdown, whether they had a partial lockdown, all right, which sectors specifically were affected. So different African countries were affected to different degrees, also depending on the measures that they took. But of course, one of the direct effects was that aggregate consumption in the economy really fell considerably because businesses could not operate in a number of sectors. Across many countries, there were considerable limitations on movement from one part of the country to the other. So those regional movement limitations are very common. So goods could not easily be transported. So that had a further adverse effect. And of course, in the general uncertainty of COVID-19, this also led to a very adverse effect on investment in many countries, not only foreign direct investment, but even domestic investment. Many firms took a wait and see attitude, okay, because of the considerable reduction in consumption because of COVID. So you could say that African countries have been affected by a combination of external and domestic shocks. We are not the worst affected when you look at it globally, but still, the impact has been quite severe. And focusing on the theme of this particular webinar, which is Jobs for Africa, the UN Economic Commission for Africa, which does frequent projections for Africa and is constantly analyzing data on different facets of African economies, projects that between 5 million and 29 million people will be pushed below the extreme poverty line of $1.9 per day. That's the universal poverty line that we use these days because of COVID-19, compared to what the baseline scenario was. And you know, this is very unfortunate because African countries are making quite good progress in terms of poverty alleviation in the last few years. So some of those gains will be eroded. And as the previous speaker mentioned, this is an issue of, the whole issue of jobs is an issue of human security. We often think of security in the traditional sense as security of the state, but now in modern conceptions of security, we also think a lot about aspects of human security. We think of the individual as the focus of security, and the question of jobs is very central. The International Labour Organization anticipates about 19 million job losses in Africa, and this of course has been spread. Different countries have been hit differently. In Kenya, for example, the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics estimates that 1.7 million jobs will be lost as a result of the pandemic. So you can see that's quite considerable in a country that has a population of about 48 million people. So the impact on jobs will be very severe. And if you see my chart there, the chart there tries to look at the impact of the growth slowdown on poverty and employment generation. And you can see there what we're thinking about now in the impact of COVID-19. We've all been adversely affected. The question is, will we be able to come out with a best case scenario where we manage to mitigate some of the effects through policies, through effective policies? And this is the role of effective policies. Or are we looking at a worst case scenario where even we're going to be hit more than that negative 1.6% negative growth that is predicted by the IMF? So in a worst case scenario, we're even thinking of the impact being considerably more. Okay, so in terms of poverty, we're expecting, of course, deterioration of this, okay, by at least 4% compared to the baseline. You can see the baseline for this year had positive projections for both poverty and employment. So in the negative scenario, you can see that now employment will be very adverse. There'll be a negative growth scenario of worse than -2% in terms of employment creation. So it means many jobs will be destroyed. Whenever you're thinking of the impact, it's always good to think in terms of scenarios. So what we gave before was a middle scenario, but there could be a worse case scenario where you're talking about even growth dropping by almost 3%, and that will of course have a very adverse impact on jobs. In a middle case scenario, you're talking of about 0.1, okay, percent there growth. That's overall, and then you're talking of best case, you might have very slow growth. All right, so some countries will still grow depending on how sectors were affected. So there's a projection for some growth for some countries. The ones that rely a lot on tourism and commodity prices, those ones are going to experience very significant negative growth. A number of others, depending on how diversified the sectors are, might still have mild growth, about 1%, 1.5%. But generally, there's a steep decline that is expected this year. And as you see from the graph there, the most steeply affected countries will be the ones that are tourism dependent and also dependent on resource intensive industries. The ones that are dependent on non-resource intensive and not dependent on tourism might have some modest growth. But everyone is affected, if not directly, indirectly, because of the adverse trade effects. And you can see there are commodity prices, the way they're expected to decline. Almost all commodity prices have dropped. Oil prices dropped steeply, then slightly started recovering, but almost all metals, and there are some countries in Africa that depend a lot on metal exports, countries like South Africa, okay, and DR Congo and a number of others. So the exception is gold, where there's been a slight improvement. You can see oil-dependent economies, you have a number of them. Angola has been very severely affected because almost 30% of Angola's GDP comes from oil. Then you can see Chad is also very severely affected. Equatorial Guinea, almost 50% of GDP comes from oil. Gabon, over 40%. Okay, some countries, of course, are affected less because they depend less. But in general, another sector that's very badly hit is tourism, and many countries in Africa have tried to revive this somewhat by sector-specific measures and also by encouraging domestic tourism. But keep in mind, roughly on average, 8.5% of Africa's GDP comes from tourism, with some countries even like the island economies deriving almost 20 to 30% of their GDP from tourism. Our exposure is particularly high because 95% of our tourists come from outside. So we don't have much intra-African travel. All right. So this makes us particularly susceptible because our sources of tourism are the countries that have been worst hit, Europe and North America. Okay. So this is what, of course, the transport sector has also been affected, air travel. Many airlines are already struggling. So you expect some of them to file for bankruptcy, seek bailouts. And just to give you an idea in terms of jobs, 6.2 million people in Africa employed in air transport. So you can see, as that has been adversely affected, you expect major layoffs. If even big airlines, huge international airlines, okay, the top 3, top 4 airlines have been involved in massive layoffs. You can imagine in our own case where our airlines are not as big, okay, and so they've really laid off many people. In terms of tourism, you can see contributions to GDP there. Some countries depend a bit more. The island economies like Seychelles, Cape Verde, Mauritius depend significantly more than the 8.5% of GDP average. Some depend to a lower extent, but still significant dependence. Countries like Egypt, South Africa also have quite some dependence on tourism. So the more the dependence, of course, the more adversely they've been affected. Another angle that's not measured enough, maybe not mentioned enough, is domestic remittances. Quite a number of our African economies depend a lot on remittances from abroad. In Kenya last year, we got almost $3 billion from remittances from the Kenyan diaspora. And you can see here, I've given a chart of dependence by different African countries. In Lesotho, almost 21% of GDP comes from diaspora remittances. Liberia, the figure is also very high. Gambia, Comoros, Cape Verde, okay? All of them almost South Sudan, and some of these are fragile economies as well. So in quite a number of countries, over 10% of GDP comes from diaspora remittances. So many of these individuals in the diaspora are located again in North America and in Europe. So as incomes fall there, as you have job losses there, these also will affect our countries very adversely. So these are just some of the mechanisms through which this will play out. We don't know yet, of course, what the exact impact will be by the end of the year, because many African countries have engaged in aggressive policies, okay, to counter this. And now the second half of my presentation, which will be brief, does some of that discussion throughout the African continent. You've seen expansionary fiscal and monetary policies. Fiscal policies deal with changes in government expenditure and tax in order to revive the economy, okay? So tax rebates and incentives of different types, increased government expenditure in affected sectors, lowering of interest rates, base interest rates. This has happened throughout African economies. And what we would say as a policy proposal, this needs to continue into next year. So those low interest rates need to be maintained, and the fiscal measures also need to be sustained to the degree possible. The important nuance I would add here is that these measures, because African governments also have, let's say, fragile fiscal positions, we juggle many fiscal priorities. So we don't have the possibility of spending a huge amount of money. We don't have social security nets that are as big as Europe and North America. So what that means is, from a policy proposal point of view, our expansionary fiscal policies have to be very specific. They shouldn't be broad-based. They should focus on the most vulnerable sectors like tourism and transport, and then also give help to vulnerable households. Because remember at the beginning we said many households will fall into poverty. So databases should be mobilized so that the most vulnerable houses are identified, and the assistance should focus on those, and also farms that have been particularly affected, especially small, medium enterprises. So this is very critical, that the expansionary fiscal and monetary policies cannot be broad-based, just giving broad-based assistance to everyone, because then what will happen is those who need it less will benefit as well, and then those who need it more will not get enough. So it has to be very, very selective expansionary fiscal policy, targeted at specific sectors and also vulnerable households. So that is a very critical part of what we suggest. Of course, sectors are now reopening in a phased manner. This has to consider, by its very nature, it has to consider, of course, the inherent risk of contagion in that sector. But a very important balancing act that we have to keep in mind in African countries is, yes, we're concerned about the spread of the pandemic. Fortunately, probably for us in Africa, we have not been hit as hard because of the point mentioned by the previous speaker, that we have a large youthful population. So the youth are less susceptible to this, okay, because they have stronger immune systems in general. So I think that's one of the key factors that explains why Africa has not suffered probably as much as many other regions of the world. This large, youthful, dynamic population. So it's been more resilient in the face of this. And then also that African countries responded quite quickly to the pandemic as well. So the policy responses were quite assertive and quite quick. So this helped us also quite a bit. But now in all African countries, we are in a stage where we're reopening sectors. And there what's very important is we need to contain the spread of infections, but that has to be balanced very carefully with revival of economies. If the health outcomes are given excessive prominence, then we run the risk of really having a very severe effect on the economy. So there has to be a balance, and we in our African economies have to try to get that balance as right as possible. One of the unique characteristics of African economies is that we have large informal sectors. In Kenya, for example, 35% of our GDP is contributed by the informal sector, and 84% of employment in Kenya comes from the informal sector. It gets generated in the informal sector. So because we have large informal sectors, when we're thinking about policies for the Jobs for Africa policies, we have to give a lot of prominence to both the formal and informal sector. That's why I emphasized before the adverse effect on small, medium enterprises, because the majority of our enterprises almost across African economies, whether you're thinking of agriculture, industry, are small, medium enterprises, and many of them are in the informal sector. So specific policies that governments take have to target the informal sector. This is very, very critical. And also accompanied by that, we have to, and this point was mentioned by the previous speaker also, we have to move towards digital solutions. And I think at the heart of this crisis, I say, and I believe very much in the idea that we should never waste a crisis. So in many countries, people have been saying this is a lost year, consider this as a lost year. But I would say, let's also consider this as a year of opportunity. So many tough policies that we've been thinking of implementing that we've not been able to do, let's take this as also an opportunity. So there's a lot of scope, even in the informal sector, for digital solutions, online commerce, okay, encouraging firms to deal with that. And then, of course, informal sector firms should be given specific assistance, like specific expenditure to help them, loan relief, rescheduling, and so on. So a lot of our policies have to also focus on that, because African economies are largely driven by the informal sector. But of course, there also has to be help for formal sectors. My big point in my policy proposals, maybe the central point that I want to make, is that Africa's future in job creation, and jobs for Africa will be premised on the extent to which we're able to innovate. So the central policy measure and the most important question we always need to be asking when we're thinking about enhancing different African sectors to promote jobs is how can we innovate? So in as much as the pandemic destroys many jobs, it also creates some opportunities. An example is the educational sector. Many universities have shifted to online delivery. Okay, and that before that was just an opportunity that was being discussed but not really implemented by the majority of them. Now the crisis gave us an opportunity to shift there. It almost gave us no choice. So that's an opportunity. And for many other sectors, manufacturing, agriculture, and so on, this presents a great opportunity for online solutions, but more broadly for innovation. When you're put in a position where you have to survive, that makes us human beings much more innovative. So I think a central pillar of all our policies for job creation will always be underpinned by innovation, right? And just saying that two facets of thinking about policies for jobs for Africa are always that we should think across different time frames. One time frame is of course the short-term time frame, the immediate recovery. But another very important time frame is long-term, because once COVID-19 is over, even if we make a good recovery, we'll now have a new normal. So we always have to be thinking in terms of this new normal. Okay, and what does the new normal present? And finally, one of the big pillars of job creation in Africa and African development in general is regional integration. Right now, we have a very big initiative in Africa called the African Continental Free Trade Area. A lot of Africa's future lies on boosting South-to-South cooperation, boosting inter-African trade. Okay, that's a very important pillar, and that will create tremendous jobs. A lot of analysis already have been done by the UN Economic Commission for Africa on this particular issue of what the job creation potential of the African Continental Free Trade Area will be. So I think let's use this as African countries as an opportunity to reinvigorate our regional initiatives. Because if we're able to integrate national and regional policy responses, this is Africa's hope and this is Africa's future. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Mudida. Professor Mudida's notes will be available on the Jobs for Africa Foundation website, so we'll be able to distribute them through that channel. I think the impact in all the sectors you've mentioned, and the most important were the policy directions that you gave, and we'll come to that.